Aloha kako. Mahalo for joining us today. Mahalo, Anna, for asking, for making this happen. I have some slides, but let's see, to kind of preface this next hour, this can be very discussion oriented. Please feel free to leave messages or insights, curiosities in the chat, and I'll pretty much be able to see them throughout the presentation. And I'm happy to indulge in tangents, as they say. So while I'm presenting slides, I have some slides to guide our discussion, but if there are things that you folks are interested in, topics that you folks want to address, then absolutely feel free to. I'm just making sure my volume is okay. I turned up my input volume a little bit. Maybe that's a little better. Okay, so let's see. Let's share some slides. It's been a while since I've been on Zoom. Is this full Chrome? How's that for? Can you folks see that screen? Good. Thank you, Anna. Okay. So today's discussion, I guess, is appropriately named Traditional Ecological Knowledge, often referred to by an acronym TEK. And specifically in linguistics, we want to talk about documenting traditional ecological knowledge, which might be overlooked sometimes in, I guess, more traditional linguistics, conventional linguistics, are more concerned with language itself and operations and phonotactics and that. But things that we use language for, specifically knowledge that we use language for, language that we are using to communicate knowledge, store knowledge, transmit knowledge, that knowledge and those knowledge systems is also extremely important. For example, this is the wrong date. Let me fix this right now. But for example, we have in Hawaiʻi, as well as pretty much all of Polynesia, at least in Eastern Polynesia, moon cycles are very important for agricultural and aquacultural industries. So the moon and the cycle, whatever moon it is going to tell us lots of information. It's going to prescribe to us lots of information about what's good to farm tonight and what's good to fish tonight. And for example, La'au Kukolu is the name of tonight's moon cycle. And we are in the month of Ikuā. Of course, in the Gregorian calendar, we would just say today is Friday, November 1st, 2024. But in a Hawaiian Eastern Polynesian knowledge system, we would call today La'au Kukolu, Ikuā, and the name La'au Kukolu is indexing, like I said earlier, agricultural and aquacultural information. It would be a good, fruitful, productive night of farming and fishing, for example. And that's what's being, that's what La'au Kukolu is telling us. For example, that's a knowledge system beyond just documenting the linguistic form of tonight's moon cycle. We also want to be able to document that knowledge, which is what we're referring to as traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK. There are all sorts and forms and types and genres of TEK. They're all culturally unique and fascinating. So that's what we're talking about today. First, I want to say mahalo. I would be, if this were in person, offering a lei probably as a way to show my gratitude to Anna Baloo, a good friend of mine, longtime colleague, and everyone at Endangered Languages Project. I say mahalo to you folks for having me, and mahalo to everyone for joining us. Real quick, some background about myself. These slides have not been updated, I'm sorry. I'm studying Olelo Hawaiʻi. I consider myself a heritage or a new speaker of Hawaiian language, Olelo Hawaiʻi, a heritage language of mine. Also, being in Hawaii, I feel a responsibility to speak and advocate for Olelo Hawaii, the indigenous language of this place. I have an MA and also a PhD. I finished my PhD. That needs to change in linguistics. So I'm coming at this topic as sort of a linguist, an educator and advocate for Hawaiian language, and also language in general, particularly minoritized languages, particularly indigenous languages. I'm also interested in just anything language related, particularly revitalization, language shift, attitudes, and our topic today, traditional ecological knowledge, of course. This picture is at our local radio station that's here on campus at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. I did for about 12 years. I had a Hawaiian language, Hawaiian music radio show every Sunday, where I got to play all kinds of old Hawaiian music, some recordings that you folks might know. And it was the entire show was presented in Olelo Hawaii, Hawaiian language. When we talk about language and culture, we usually it's a very popular and general idea that the interconnectedness between both a language and a culture cannot be overstated. Usually, a certain language, or at least a language variety, identifies a specific group of people. Therefore, engaging with another language means engaging with the language and culture tied to it. I think that's misquoted. I apologize. We cannot generally understand a culture without understanding its language and vice versa. I'm sure you folks are aware of this concept. It's the concept that really motivates certain types of curriculum development, especially for indigenous languages. Indigenous languages curriculum should also be developed alongside or married to curriculum about cultural revitalization. For example, in the Hawaii context, lots of Hawaiian language schools or classrooms will actually leave the classroom and go into lo'ikalo, which is a taro patch, where the community or the classroom or the students will do their entire class in Hawaiian language or have their school day in the actual classroom, which is now outside in the cultural setting of a lo'ikalo. And if we understand what a lo'ikalo is and its cultural symbolism to Hawaii, then it is an important setting or a context where language learning and language engaging and language use can happen and should happen as it's as close as possible to another cultural practice, such as harvesting kalo, harvesting taro, and many other examples of culturally informed language pedagogy or linguistically informed cultural pedagogy, as those two go so hand in hand. But if we're talking about language documentation and conservation, it's important for us to understand that those two are connected. Language and culture are so intimately connected. Also, we want to recognize the importance of culture and tradition, as well as cultural and traditional knowledge. The moon cycles I was talking about earlier are a great example of traditional knowledge. And unfortunately, a lot of those examples of traditional knowledge are the first vulnerable, are the first to feel threatened when language shift starts to happen. Luckily, we recovered that knowledge system, moon cycles, before it was, lost into the abyss. But lots of these cultural knowledge systems and traditions are vulnerable when languages start to shift. It's also important that we recognize the biodiversity in our world, among and across and between cultures. And we strive as language documentarians and conservationists and language champions and advocates to document and conserve cultural, traditional, and ecological knowledge systems. Of course, as part and parcel of just sort of strictly more traditional language documentation. We say that, or I don't know who says this. Hopefully, lots of folks might agree with this, that the field of linguistics has a kuleana, or in other words, a specific assigned responsibility to empower communities so they have the means to determine their own linguistic destiny. This quote was really from personal communication from a linguist here at the University of Hawaii, Dr. Andrea Perez Croker. Part of empowering communities is through thorough documentation, informed by paying attention to what matters culturally, socially, to the community. Everything that matters, everything they're using their language to communicate might also be considered traditional knowledge, or at least ecological knowledge, or both. And that's what is important and worthy of knowing and transmitting, and therefore documenting. So before I move on, I want to check my chat. Let me see. What is more? Good questions. Vicente asking, which is more? Okay, Anna, you said you're gonna keep track of them. Mahalo. Keep track
We
of
can
those
do
questions.
either way if you want to answer now. Go for it. Either way.
Okay. Let's see. Which is more prominent, language or culture? I know they're interrelated, but a different system in their own right. Yeah. I think the issue, which is more prominent, is it language that's more prominent or culture that's more prominent, is a case by case answer. One answer will not aptly explain every situation. I think I can only speak for Hawaii's context. And I would say our culture is probably more prominent at this point in time. Lots of cultural practices that are traditionally Hawaiian are transmitted and communicated using English, or at least the pidgin English that we speak here. And we are on the way to revitalizing our language, and hopefully those cultural practices can one day be practiced and taught and celebrated entirely in Hawaiian, or mostly in Hawaiian at least. But for now, I would say for the Hawaii case, our culture is probably more prominent than our language right now. Yeah, but good question. And I would be interested in hearing what the case is, what the contexts are in different places where you folks are joining us from today. So what is cultural and traditional knowledge? We've talked a little bit about this already. I wanted to basically share a couple of examples from the Hawaiian context, and they're very specific and they're very traditional from the Hawaiian context. And I think they're very poetic and beautiful, and that's why I chose them today. We every year, yeah, Anna, we decide if we're going to play this video.
I think you totally should. It's great.
Let's see. While I'm queuing it up, I'll kind of talk about what this is. So this Mo'olelo Uiwi, a traditional story. If I were to characterize it, it is sort of kind of a fable meant for children. This is very much a mo'olelo that would be told to children at night before they go to sleep, for example. But that doesn't at all minimize the what we can learn from this. The content itself is very powerful. So we chose this particular mo'olelo uiwi because there are hundreds, as other cultures have. There's so many stories. This is just one. And we chose this one because of what it teaches us, what cultural context it provides us, what cultural etiquette and norms it teaches us. So it's only under 3 minutes long. So I think I'll share this video and then we'll talk about it after. Let me mute myself for now.
The audio's not coming through.
I think because I muted myself, it muted the whole thing. I'll unmute myself, but hopefully it's not too much background noise interference. Here we go.
No laila, I kona hiki ana mai kane wahe mai. Ua lulu ka wa'a i ke kai. Ka kani kia nui. I lohe i hana ka iwani a nui, ka lua nui lea. Ua lohe i kona ue ana, e ke kahi he e loku mai kai. I nao kua ka he i ai. E nui, ia kua pinikia. A pana ka iwani. Ua nao hana kua ua. Ua lima paha i ke kai. No ka mea, a ole paha mai kai ko u ho'o pa'a ana. A ole hiki ia'u ke ho'i aku i mokoli'i. No ka mea, a ole hiki ia'u ke au au. A mai ka he na ane pale pale. A ole pilikia, hiki paha ia'u ke kokua aku ia oe. E pihi ai oe i luna o ko'u po'a. A e ho'i aku au ia oe i kou honi. Ike kau anu ka i ole maluna kona po'a. U ho'o nuka ka he'e i ho'i aku i mokoli'i. Unu ka nui o koka i ole mahau. A hea kula ka he'e. E noho maali e oe, mai makai. Kama aina loa au i ki a kai. Nā hote iho, wa hike kula lau i mokoli. Ua iho i hana ka i ole, mai luna iho koka he'e po. Aha e kula o ia iai. He mahalo nui a kula ia oe na kōlawe ana mai iau. Ai ke kahi makana nao maluna ko po'o. A hola ari dia kula ka i ole i uka. Ua haha e la ka he'e maluna kona po'o. A loa a ke kupai. Ua ki o ka i ole maluna ke po'o no ka mea maka u noa uia. Ka hihi nui ka he'e. Mai kira ni hana. I nā ike i e ka leho e ka he'e. Ua lalau o ia iaia no ka mea mana o oia. Ka i ole no ia. Ana ka kai paki pika i se tahi nei kaka i e he leu he'e. Me ka pōhake, ana ka leho. A loa ka he'e ia laku me ke ia mea. Ui pihi belo ka ao.
Oh yeah, that is our Mo'olelo Oiwi, traditional Hawaiian story. This version of the video was not doctored. The original Mo'olelo, the original wording was kept intact. We saved all of it. We didn't change any of it. And a lot of times that's important, how it was originally told and passed down for centuries. We wanted to preserve exactly how it was passed down. There's another, we adapted this particular video and story into a language assessment tool, but this is the undoctored one. So if you're just joining us, we're talking about traditional ecological knowledge and how every language encodes all kinds of knowledge systems, and how it's important to also document not just the language itself, but the knowledge that is encoded in that language, the knowledge that the language uses to teach and perpetuate and expand. Those a lot of times that cultural knowledge, that knowledge, all those knowledge systems are culturally specific and culturally unique. So we are talking about documenting those languages, but and those knowledge systems, but they might be sometimes difficult to identify. We might go into a language documentation setting and not necessarily realize, oh, this is an important traditional knowledge system that should be documented. So I wanted to share this video as kind of an example of what is important in a Hawaiian context. I know of obviously this entire narration this entire video was in Hawaiian language, but even the visuals that were presented should give you an idea of what's culturally important and relevant and prominent in a Hawaiian context. Of course, lots of things to do with a lot of marine life. We have, let's see what else we have in this. What's important in Olelo Hawaii? Well, basically everything that we saw included in this mo'olelo that we just watched. We have a land and ocean setting. So we have an ecological setting. We have biological information, species in that ecology that are still living, of course, today. He'e and Iole, a squid and a rat. We have technology. We have a va'a, which was the canoe that we saw that the rat used to paddle between islands. And we saw the luhe'e at the very end, which is an octopus lure or a squid lure that was is uniquely Hawaiian and still used today by local fishermen to catch octopus and squid. We also have place names that are encoding geographical knowledge and information, spatial literacy, and space making. A lot of the names that were mentioned in this have meanings that refer to histories, and we also have origin and creation. The sort of the origin of the Iole, it's these creatures themselves, and the creation of this rivalry that exists between them, between two creatures, two animals, two species. We see relationships, and we also see values and sort of etiquette. You might not have noticed all of these things because it, of course, was in the Hawaiian language, but we indeed have a lot of this mo'olelo makes points about all of these things. Yeah. So together we can say that all of these knowledge systems constitute a language's worldview. Yeah. A worldview is an important word for today. A worldview can sort of be synonymous with, or at least the worldview is the space where all of this culturally relevant traditional ecological knowledge is going to be, it's going to live there. It lives in a language's worldview. And so when we're talking about language documentation, we're not just documenting the language, we're also trying to document the worldview that is interconnected and interrelated with the language itself, because all worldviews are unique. A language's worldview is it lives at the core of language documentation and conservation. It's just as important to document the worldview as it is to document the language itself. We have another question. Michael, I'm into folkloristics. I want to appreciate the sharing of the story, but may I ask what was it about? Basically, the Iole, the rat, he lives on a different island, right off the coast of the main island, and he wants to go to the main island one day. And so he boards his va'a, his canoe. And when he gets to the main island, he ties his canoe to a coconut tree, but he doesn't tie it well enough. So the knot loosens and the ocean takes his canoe. So he's upset and he starts crying. And that's when the he'e, the octopus, steps in and says, "Hey, what's going on? Can I help you?" And the octopus offers to take the rat back on his head. Because he says, "Oh, don't worry, I can swim and I know this ocean very well. I'll get you back home." What happens while the rat is riding on the octopus's head is he gets so scared. And he gets scared enough to lose control of, he makes mess. He makes a mess on the octopus's head. I don't say this to be humorous in that way. It's just what happens in our mo'olelo. The rat makes mess on the octopus's head, which is the motivation still today why those two species, those two animals don't get along. And there's also the motivation for why we have an octopus lure, because we make octopus lure, the luhe'e is made to look like the mouse or the rat. because every time the octopus sees the lure, it thinks it's the rat and it wants its revenge. So we make the lure look like, resemble the rat to catch the octopus. And that's the gist of the story. When I say it by myself, I have a different reaction. But good question. Let's see. Also in this mo'olelo, we see, if we translated this English, the reason we left it in Hawaiian, of course, was so it can be used as a teaching tool in Hawaiian language immersion schools and classrooms. But also, if we translate it into any other language besides Hawaiian, we're going to lose so much, which is the gamble that we take every time translating out of an original language. As good as the translation could, as fantastic as the translation could be, we are losing a lot of nuance and subtlety that is perfectly accurately conserved in the original language. And these words that often get stripped of meaning are words like kinship terms, indexical knowledge like taxonomies, names and words for flora and fauna, so ethnobotanical terms, also words about technology, is the word va'a, which would be translated into English as canoe, but va'a and canoe are not exactly the same, right? They're not culturally identical. So the translations are only an estimation. Also, the topic today, what we're talking about, cultural, traditional, ecological knowledge. When we're translating from one language to another, things are going to be lost. We know that there's different ways of knowing, alternative literacies, alternative different epistemologies, knowledge systems, ways of knowing, what counts as knowing, and ways to pass on that knowledge are all different and very culturally unique and culturally specific. So those are all kinds of things that we're looking for in our pursuit of language documentation. I want to share quickly 3 examples from the Hawaiian context. 3 examples from Hawaii that show ecological importance. They're important in materially, in terms of material culture. They're also important in our folklore and our mythscape. And of course, linguistically speaking, these things are important as well. These 3 examples. The first example is our ohi'a lehua, which is now more than ever important that we talk about because we have what's called ROD in Hawaii, ROD. ROD stands for rapid ohi'a death. This tree is rapidly dying, which is acutely depressing and problematic because of how important it is in our ecology, to our material culture, to our mythscape, to our language. Ohi'a lehua is invaluable in Hawaii. Ecologically speaking, it's possibly related to the root word ohi, which means to gather. And the ohi'a gathers lots and lots of water. And ohi'a is a visible terrestrial sign of underground water. It's also significant because it's the first tree to grow out of new lava. Fascinating to think about. With lava, a new lava flow, basically wiping the ecological slate clean, and causing everything to regenerate from brand new. Somehow the lava brings these seedlings, these sproutlings, these trees grow out of new lava. Yeah, it's ecologically pretty incredible. We also have, I don't want to get too much into this sort of different knowledge system, this wonderful example of traditional ecological knowledge, but the ohi'a exists in harmony with another species. Ohi'a lehua is also a kalo as well as a tree. It's also a variety of taro that we grow in Hawaii. And these two, ohi'a lehua as the tree and the ohi'a lehua as the taro, the kalo, exist in what we call epistemological pairs. And it brings balance to what we call the Hawaiian universe. Very extremely important in terms of traditional ecological knowledge. Hopefully, luckily, fortunately, that traditional ecological knowledge was documented alongside just Hawaiian language, just the Ohi'alehua word itself. We've had enough people document the word the term Ohi'alehua. We've also had enough people to document the fact that this exists in what we call an epistemological pair. Fortunately. And that's the goal of documenting traditional ecological knowledge, not just the word or the term or the language itself, also the knowledge behind it. Speaking of what we use Ohi'alehua to make, it's a wonderful and reliable hardwood, and a beautiful hardwood at that. I wish I had an example to show you folks. Hawaii is known for acacia, the koa, but also lehua is a beautiful wood. Ohi'alehua wood, also increasingly rare. The leaves and the blossoms of the lehua tree are used in lei. We make lei, we make lehaku, we make all kinds of lei to adorn ourselves with. And it's also significant in the hula performance and practice of hula, traditional Hawaiian dance. In the mythscape, Ohi'alehua is featured in dozens, if not hundreds, of stories. It has different symbolism as well. The Ohi'alehua is symbolic of love, is symbolic of female energy, women, and is also innuendo of some more risque things as well. Let's see. There's a question in the chat. Paula's asking, I'd like to ask about methodology to combine linguistics and other discipline. If you have some. Good question, Paula. Good, very thought-provoking. I think we'll save that for the end and maybe discuss that with others, if that's okay. Linguistically speaking, Ohi'alehua, just by itself, in the language of Hawaiian, it means expert, swift, strong, warrior, first warrior onto a battlefield. It also means sweetheart. It denotes or refers to a beloved friend or relative, among other poetic references. It has a cloud of meaning. Ohi'alehua has so many meanings around it. Words like that exist in all languages, and hopefully, when we are in the field documenting languages, we're documenting all the shades and all the connotations and all the related meanings of a single word or a single term. The second example I want to share with you folks, kukui. If you've been to Hawaii, you've probably seen this tree, or you've probably at least seen the lei that we use, the nuts that we use to make lei. It's a iconic lei, and I think I have a picture of it. But ecologically speaking, the kukui, in English, the word is, the name is the candlenut tree. I believe it's Hawaii state tree. The Latinate name is Alurites molucana. I would never recognize that name, but we just call it a kukui tree. It's important in the forest because it's so big and it's so strong, and it provides a whole bunch of resources. That's why it's ecologically valuable and important. We use the leaves, we use the flowers, we use the nuts, we use the sap, we use the wood. Here's a picture of the nuts, the material culture, the kukui nut. The wood itself is too soft for canoes. We might be able to use them temporarily, but they're usually too soft to make long-term canoes for use over a long period of time. But the sap and the bark is used for dyes. The sap is also, I didn't list this on this slide, but the sap is used to catch birds. Pluck some feathers off. We use feathers for all kinds of things in Hawaii. Mostly leis and chiefly regalia. And then we release the birds. The birds are never slaughtered. But the nuts, Kukui nut is used for they're chewed up to make chum for fishing. They're used in lei making. They also are used, I'll let you folks in on a secret. If you've been to Hawaii or if you've had or heard of poke, poke isn't poke, in my opinion, without inamona. Inamona is a relish, a condiment that uses kukui, roasted kukui nuts. Inamona changes the flavor of poke. It makes it very that much better. Yeah. What else is kukui important for? In our folklore, in our stories, in our mythological lore, it's a kinolau. It's a physical plant representation of kamapua'a. Kamapua'a is a shape-shifting, powerful, magical being in Hawaii. He takes the shape of a pig. And if we look at the pig's head are, I should probably say boar, more specifically, more accurately. Hawaiian hogs or boars in the forest like to eat the nuts of the kukui tree. And the leaf of this tree represents the snout and the ears of the pua'a. I think I have an example here. If we look at the shape of this, of Kamapua'a's pua'a head, when he is taking at least his head is taking the form of a boar, the shape is similar to the actual kukui leaf. So something that we would consider very important in language documentation in Hawaiian sense. Linguistically, kukui means lamp, light, torch. Symbolically, kukui, if it's meaning lamp or light, it's also meaning a leader or a guide, or enlightenment and wisdom. Yeah. I'm hearing someone. If let me see, sure that is. Anna, can you hear that as well?
I think we're good now.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Sorry. That's the second example. Kukui, so we've covered Ohi Alehua, we've covered kukui as examples of very rich knowledge systems that exist in a Hawaiian context. The third and final example I want to talk about is this iwa. The iwa is the word or the name for this the shorebird, a bird that we have in Hawaii, is called this iwa. It's native to Hawaii. It doesn't visit too often the upland forests. It mostly stays in the coastal regions as a native shorebird, a shorebird native to Hawaii. It actually eats regular food that other birds eat, but also eats other birds. So it is a kind of carnivorous species. And it forces them to disgorge their food. It's symbolic of that kind of authority or that kind of position in the food chain. We use parts from the iwa, such as the feathers, in gifts because its superior position in the Hawaiian ecosystem. Its feathers are symbolic of that kind of superiority, that kind of respect. I've seen iwa feathers given to leaders and people who have lots of influence. And also they're used in feather lei making and kahili, which are emblems, which are symbols of royalty. iwa are also master navigational aids. If you're on the ocean and you're lost or you need to find your way, and iwa will help you tremendously. They are land spotters. They will find land. Motifs the shape and the body and the general appearance of an Iwa is replicated in all kinds of tattoos and all kinds of carving patterns and all kinds of art. And if we think back to the Ohi'alehua, the tree that we looked at first, the first example, and its existence in an epistemological pair, the Iwa also has a pair, which is an Iwa fern. I believe it's called a maiden's hair fern. The maiden's hair fern in Hawaiian is called Iwa, like this bird is. And those two, the fern and the bird, exist in a harmonious relationship that we call an epistemological pair, that we say in a Hawaiian way of knowing, in a Hawaiian knowledge system, those two things are related. And they bring balance to the Hawaiian ecosystem, or the Hawaiian universe. They're also important in our myths. Iwa are symbolic of attractive people. They're used as metaphors in all dozens, hundreds of songs. Instead of referring to that attractive person over there, I will just call them an Iwa. Figuratively, an Iwa is used to also denote thievery because of their instinctual behaviors of stealing food from other birds, but also symbolic, of course, of their navigational knowledge and value. And they're also a parent. They are the parent of a kauae bird, which is another shore bird. So there's a familial symbolism that Iwa carry. In terms of just linguistic value, if we say kikaha ka Iwa, we're talking about the Iwa bird is soaring. Kikaha is flying without flapping wings. And the Iwa is a master at doing that. Riding the wind, not needing to use or expend energy to stay in flight. Sometimes we take away this first letter in the word Iwa, which is the okina, the glottal stop. And if we just have Iwa, that means the number 9. Iwa means number 9. Symbolically, the Iwa is used in the greatest king in Hawaii's history, Kamehameha. One of Kamehameha's many nicknames, many epithets, many given names throughout his life that were afforded to him or attributed to him, the more and more powerful he became, was Ka'iwa Kilo Moku. And Ka'iwa Kilo Moku means the island snatching Iwa bird, because of how many districts and islands Kamehameha was able to bring into his dominion and his jurisdiction. So, before we go into this next slide, those are 3 examples of ecological knowledge, traditional knowledge that speak to and reference culturally specific knowledge systems that we should be paying attention to. If instead of just documenting what an Iwa is, what an Ohi'alehua is, and what a kukui is, we should also be thinking about how are all 3 of those things linguistically, ecologically, folklorically, and culturally important and valuable. Yeah. And those are the kinds of information. That's the kind of information we also want to document. Should all knowledge be documented? At this point, you folks are probably wondering how much of this knowledge, especially when it's traditional, especially when it's cultural, especially when it's ecological, especially when it's been passed down for generations, centuries, millennia, how much of that should be documented? Because when we document it, it might fall into the wrong hands. And it's absolutely okay that some forms of knowledge are sacred and not meant to be shared publicly. Some forms of knowledge should absolutely be kept private. That's absolutely okay. So we should also be thinking about some solutions to make sure that this knowledge is passed on appropriately, if it is meant to be passed on. Because we also, even if it's not meant to be public, we don't want it to be so private that it becomes lost. So what are solutions that we can devise to make sure this knowledge continues, is transmitted, and is documented appropriately? important question for us to ask. And while we're asking and we're asking this question, we're thinking about answering this question, I want to bring up a word I introduced earlier. In Olelo Hawaii, in Hawaiian language, we have a very, very important word, kuleana. And in kuleana is one of those words that if you want to translate it into English, for example, you'll need a whole paragraph because of its many connotations, because of its many different dimensions, and because of its cultural importance. So these are all the things that kuleana means. I bring up this word, I introduce this word into our discussion as we're thinking about this question about what is appropriate to document and how do we document things appropriately? How do we document knowledge appropriately? I want us to think about kuleana as a kind of a cyclical kind of situation where the more responsibility you show to a knowledge system, or the more responsibility you show to an ecosystem, or the more responsibility you show to a language or a person or people or a community, you have the privilege of interacting with them, speaking for them, speaking on their behalf. And the more privilege you have means you should also have more responsibility to them. That's what kuleana really is. The cyclical relationship between responsibility and privilege. So I think we are almost, I'm almost to the end of my slides, and we can discuss and think about these things. What are some examples of different knowledge systems in your region, in your community, in your culture, represented by your language? And of course, how do we make sure to value them equally? And I should also say, how do we make sure that we value them appropriately? How do we make sure we document them appropriately? Another way of getting at this discussion, another way of framing this discussion is, what is your kuleana to your language? What is your kuleana to your culture? What is your kuleana to your community? We also have to think about outsiders. What is the researcher's kuleana, or what is the outsider person's kuleana to their own research? And what is their kuleana to another person or another culture's or another community's language and culture? And what is their kuleana to the community that they work with or the communities that they work with? Yeah, I think that's all I have. So that's a lot of questions, but I wanted to just ask it in different ways to kind of inspire that discussion. I know we started late. Anna, how much time do we have?
First, thanks. That was fantastic as always. So everybody, let's have a round of applause. Yeah. And time-wise, I think we can go a little bit longer if folks have questions and want to discuss, assuming that you have time, Ha'a.
Sure.
So, yeah, everybody feel free to put your questions in the chat, or if you would like to ask verbally, go ahead and unmute and ask. And if you want, I can MC and like read questions out to you, or you can read them yourself, whatever works.
Sure. If you want to, I know Michael had a point in the chat. Anna, you want to kind of MC that?
Sure. So Michael notes that in his training, folklore, whether verbal, social folk customs, material culture, or folk performing arts, the knowledge has to pass the 3-generation and historical geographical tests. So folklore should have been passed on in at least 3 generations and should have a wide distribution in a geographic area with variance.
With variance, that's the only thing I'm not super clear on. Michael, should have a wide distribution in a geographic area with variance. Okay, so like there's a sort of this region might practice it this way or tell it this way. I think if I'm understanding that correctly. Good point. I've never heard of this test, but all 3 examples that I shared certainly passed the test, both tests, I guess. but thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, always really cool to learn how sort of different disciplines approach these things. We have a question. Oh, go ahead,
No, go ahead. Maybe Weira's question. Anna, you want to read that one?
Yeah, so Wera asks, how do Indigenous languages encode specific ecological knowledge that may be difficult to translate or express in non-Indigenous languages?
Yeah, great question. I don't think it's a one size fits all situation either. And that's kind of what I was saying earlier, that it might be difficult to, especially if you're not familiar with, if you're going to do field work or language documentation work if you're new to wherever you're doing that work, you might not even realize that there's ecological knowledge encoded in the language that you're documenting. So how it can be difficult to identify opportunities that are ripe and rich for traditional ecological knowledge documentation. So that's when it becomes important to build relationships with your community, your speakers, maybe even explain to them that, hey, listen, I'm doing what we call language documentation, but part of that is documenting knowledge that you folks have traditionally and ecologically that are important culturally to you folks, and I don't want to miss that. And if it's appropriate, can you folks maybe if you have the if at any point you think that this is important, a knowledge system that I should be documenting it, can you let me know? I think that's probably okay to do if you have the right spirit and the right relationship with the people that you're working with. Code specific knowledge. And do you have anything to add to that?
Oh, no, I just think that's a fantastic answer. Yeah, always return to your relationships with folks and just try and explain what you're doing and get help from the people you're working with. And that sort of goes back to Paula's question where she asked about methodologies to combine linguistics with other disciplines. And she said she specifically is working with an ethnobiologist, but in fieldwork, it's hard to combine linguistic elicitation and ethnobiological elicitation. Any thoughts?
Let me go back up to Paula's question. But on field work, it's hard to combine the linguisticness. Yeah. And I'm assuming that difficulty is probably rooted in our tendency to separate knowledge. This kind of knowledge is linguistic. So a linguist, that's the business of a linguist. And this type of knowledge is ethnobotanical. So that's the business of an ethnobotanist. But I really am a proponent and a believer that of a very, I support holistic approaches to this kind of knowledge. So, meaning you can kind of do away with those boundaries between linguistic knowledge and ethnobotanical knowledge and just call it knowledge. And that's what's important to, even if we're just working within our capacity as linguists or language documentarians. Yeah.
Right on. We have a cool question from Riatung, who is one of ELP's interns this year. Hi, Riatung. He finds it interesting that the iwa and the way it's woven into the culture in Naga people's culture, who are wedged between Myanmar, India, the hornbill bird is considered sacred and is similar and revered, even by some indigenous groups in Indonesia. And it made him reflect on your reference to the iwa. So thank you.
Cool. Hornbill, would love to see the name in the indigenous language or indigenous languages. If that's if we know that, if you folks know that, or if it's available. Cool.
Yeah. All right, we have a really interesting question from Nicole. In the age of technology and mass sharing of info, how do you protect culturally sensitive information while still sharing with your people who may not be physically close? We had so much shared in our early days of contact without permission, and now we're playing catch up.
So much shared without permission in our early days. Totally, absolutely. I think, Nicole, your question is getting at some really important themes. I think of diaspora when I was reading your question, I thought of, yeah, what about how can people in living away from their homeland, or as we would say, living in the diaspora, do they get to access this knowledge if indeed it is documented and documented with certain restrictions? That one thing to think about is, okay, if it's private, and if it's designated for only certain people who can access it, it's important that when a field worker or a linguist or a language documentarian has created a certain record of documentation, it's important for them to really have honest conversations built on relationships of trust that they have with the community, to say, now we have to decide where this knowledge lives and who can access it and how we're going to protect it. And I think that conversation will answer a lot of the questions that you're raising, because you're right. This age of technology makes it very, very difficult. I wouldn't say impossible, but it makes it difficult to protect culturally sensitive information. And that information must be protected. And there are ways. There's some literature on best practices and archiving and storing information. And a lot of those protocols are culturally informed. They're responding to cultural protocol and cultural etiquette, and those protocols should be absolutely determined by the community themselves, the community itself. Anna, you have anything to add to that?
Oh, I'm right there with you. I think I'll drop some technical options in the chat if you're looking for maybe software tools that can help storing and protecting cultural knowledge. But yeah, at the end of the day, it's hard to find a good solution where you can share with the people you want to share with, but not the people you don't want to share with. But luckily, a lot of really smart folks are working on this from the perspective of Indigenous data sovereignty. So we'll probably have some really good tools out there in the future.
Indigenous data sovereignty. Yeah, that's a great term to know, just as a way to keep up and up with this discussion. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just going to pick out a few questions from the ones that are still coming in, because I know that you're staying past the time you were going to be here. Let's see. So we have an interesting question. Can we classify languages into two groups? One as consumer languages for indigenous languages, which often don't have extensive vocabulary for modern technology like computers and cell phones, and therefore borrow from other languages, and the others as production languages for languages that produce a vast range of vocabulary and innovations.
Interesting question. Very, very good question, Kunzang. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. There's something else. In such case, how to create such words such as cartoon, which look fascinating, help to retain old knowledge, yet it's not so relevant in the real world. Really good question. I think instead of answering the question, is this a binary? Is a language either a consumer language or a production language? I think we should probably talk about very critically why some languages have to borrow so many words. Speaking again on the behalf of the Hawaiian language context, we borrow lots and lots and lots of words from English. And part of that is because Hawaiian is trying to keep up with English. And the sort of problem underlying that is English is moving so quickly into the future, right? And So maybe a way of answering your question might be talking about the power that and authority that English has in the world, and criticizing that. How did English become so powerful, and why does why do so many languages? I'm assuming, or I could just ask in my own context. Why does Hawaiian have to borrow so many English words? I think that power differential is at the core of the of this question, more than whether or not a language is a consumer language or a production language. But very good question. And I think it's also, to add to that, um, some communities, some speakers, some languages might be more accepting and more open and more willing to borrow words from major languages like English or French or whatever. And others might not be, and that's okay too. And I think it's up to the community to decide how much. We have actually, the Hawaiian language has a committee of people specifically dedicated to coining new terms. I don't even know. I'm not sure if you folks remember what an iPod is, because it's an obsolete thing now. But when an iPod first came out in 2001 or something, we had to decide what the word is, what we're going to call it in Hawaiian, because of how many people bought iPods, because of how many people used iPods, because of how quickly that changed how we listen to music. We needed a word for it. That kind of, in that particular example, we produced a word. We did not consume one from another language. But that doesn't mean we don't consume or we don't borrow from other words from other languages. So it's kind of a case by case answer, at least for Hawaiian. But great question. Yeah.
Yeah, and Kunzang, I think we talked about this a little bit in week one about how language endangerment has nothing to do with a language itself, right? It's all about sort of the situation that people who use that language are in. And similarly, borrowing from other languages doesn't necessarily have anything to do with a language itself. It's more about the relationships that are currently happening between people who use that language and people who use other languages, right? And so English, people might want to call that a production language, but English borrows tons and tons of words for things that we don't have. We borrowed words for coffee and karaoke, and even in Hawaii, you'll find that English has a lot of Hawaiian words in it to describe stuff that there's no English word for. So
Mhm.
yeah, like Ha'a said, it's not a binary. It really is just sort of more a way of understanding the relationships between groups of people who use different languages.
Mhm.
And Abdul Kadir says lexical borrowing is a universal feature of all languages, even the so-called big languages like English borrow a lot. Yeah, exactly. All languages are both consumers and producers. Well said.
Absolutely. I've heard a not so flattering description of English by a linguist whose name is escaping me, but I've heard English described as the shower drain of languages that just takes a whole bunch of features or words or even more from different languages and um, includes it in what we know as English, or at least modern English.
Yeah, I love that metaphor. Oh, and just to return, Kunzang's second question, I think he was just asking, how did you make this cartoon? How did this Mo'olelo cartoon come to be?
Oh, good question. So our friend of and colleague, Anna and I were in school around the same time as this person. Her name is Danny Yarbrough. She's now based in Boise, Idaho. She's an artist and an animator, I guess now you could call her. She made this in I think it's called Pro. It's an iPad app, Pro something. Anyway, she made all the animations, and myself and two colleagues recorded the voices, and she put them all together. And that's why it's not maybe like Photoshop quality, but it's possible to do this with limited resources. Yeah. And we did this probably within 2 weeks. And I would love to do others because it's fun. I think in a Hawaiian language classroom, a lot of the students like this kind of thing, no matter how old they are. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to share the name of a new program I just learned about at the Stabilizing Indigenous Languages Symposium, where it lets you record voices for Indigenous language cartoons and just kind of it automatically makes a cartoon. I really want to share that, but I can't remember the name of the program. So I'll try and find it and share it with y'all. It's really cool. Lets you make cartoons quick and easy.
Oh, because this was about 6 or yeah, probably 6 years ago now. And given how much technology has advanced in that time, I would assume this we could replicate this same story, same kind of cartoon, same sort of graphics, and do it a lot more easily. And that's great news. Yeah, Anna, if you find that, please let me know. I would love to check it out.
Right.
I think Stuart just wants a quick link to this. I'm happy to give one. Let me just find the, let's see.
And while you are looking for that link, I'm going to read out one more very complex question. So
Okay.
folk histories and other in-depth investigations require triangulation to prove their veracity. But sometimes there is a dearth of evidence and documents to rely on, and sometimes data is in attrition too. What are your suggestions about this? Lots to unpack in this question.
Yeah, I'm trying to find that in the chat. Whose question was that again, Anna?
This was from, let's see, I just pasted it back in. This was from Vicente, and I sent it to you just now.
Got it. Okay. But sometimes there's a dearth of evidence. Um, if someone is doubting the, I'm not. Maybe you can clarify further your question, Vicente. But require triangulation and require sort of a validation that it's historical to prove their veracity. Oh yes, Rowena, it is Procreate. Thank you so much for finding that. But Vicente, I'm not sure I'm understanding your question. I think it's a valid issue to address that sometimes traditional ecological knowledge might be a little too anecdotal, maybe, or it might be risky because it can be variable. In fact, in Hawaii, in the case of Hawaii, it is very variable. It is extremely variable. And too much variety might undercut some of the credibility, especially, and I can understand why you as the researcher might be concerned about the veracity of what you're documenting and needing that triangulation or that sort of confirmation that there's evidence that makes this traditional, right? That really verifies that this is traditional knowledge. That's an absolutely valid point and concern, especially when the language is undergoing attrition and might be losing speakers or at least undergoing revitalization. I think my suggestion would just be, of course, cite your sources, even if that's a person. I think the community has generally a pretty good idea of who's credible. if the knowledge is coming from a person and not a source, not a written source, the source is a human. Well, all sources are humans, right? In my most people would say. I think the community has generally a good idea of what could be considered, what would be considered valid and traditional. But that might, that other person might have a good example, good suggestion as well. Who was that? Michael was talking about how the tests of what counts as customary. Yeah. Folklore has to pass a certain test for it to be considered folklore, right? So that might be an interesting conversation, but absolutely valid concern. What is traditional? We ask that question in Hawaii all the time because at least in Hawaii, cultural appropriation is still very rampant. Linguistic appropriation is still very rampant, and people will say this is Hawaiian and this is traditional, and absolutely have no basis and no grounds and no grounding to make that claim. So it's a huge issue here, and I would assume elsewhere as well. It's an issue. So great question.
Let's see. I don't see any other questions so far. So last call, folks. If you have any more questions for Ha'a today, drop them in the chat or unmute.
And Stuart, I have the link, and but I'll probably have to go find it after. But if you would like it, please get in touch, and Anna will have my email, and I'm sure we can be in touch in that way.
Yeah, and if folks have questions that they didn't get a chance to ask today, are you open to being emailed, Ha'a?
Absolutely. Please do be in touch. Absolutely. I will write my email in the chat. Please do be in touch. I would love to stay in touch with all of you folks.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thanks everybody for being here today. This was a fantastic session as always. So let's have another big thank you to Ha'a for today's workshop. Yay.
Hello. Thank you for having me, folks. That was fun.
Yeah. And next week, oh, and I'm seeing some wonderful aloha in the chat. And next week we will be back at this same time, and I'm excited to be leading a session on one of my favorite topics, sociolinguistic documentation. So tune in, it'll be a good time again, and we'll see you all next week. Take care, everybody. Be safe and healthy, and have a good weekend. Bye, y'all.
Bye. Have a good weekend.